In 1916, we witnessed the most lopsided defeat in college football history. Georgia Tech defeated Cumberland College of Kentucky 222-0. Georgia Tech scored 32 touchdowns in that game. Cumberland College never made a first down. They turned the ball over 15 times. They fumbled 9 times and threw 6 interceptions. The coach for Georgia Tech was John Heisman of Heisman Trophy fame. It is reported that late in the second quarter, Georgia Tech scored 63 points in the first quarter. They scored 63 points in the second quarter. The game was so lopsided, they shortened the second half. The quarters were reduced from 15 minutes to 12 minutes each. But late in that second quarter, the game was already close to probably 130 or 40-0. Cumberland player fumbled the ball. As the ball rolled forward, it rolled toward one of his teammates. And the Cumberland player that fumbled the ball said, "Pick it up, pick it up, pick it up." And his teammate looked at him and said, "You pick it up, you dropped it." At that point in the game, his teammate had already given up. It seemed to be a hopeless situation. Most of us can understand to some degree how that player must have felt. For we've been in situations when we were about ready to quit trying. We're about ready to quit. We're about ready to give up. The Apostle Paul faced great obstacles in his ministry. He faced opposition and much difficulty. And yet, in light of what was going on around him in hard times, he wrote these words, and they serve as the basis for my message today, a message I've entitled, "Don't Lose Heart." Don't lose heart. And that title really grows out of Paul's own words. Notice 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1. Paul said, "We don't lose heart," at the end of the verse. And then look down at verse 16, at the beginning of the verse. Again he says, "Therefore, we do not lose heart." Let me tell you, the people that I've come to appreciate, the longer I've lived, I've come to appreciate these folks the most. They're not the flashy people. They're not the people who are the most gifted amongst us. But they are those people who year after year, they keep staying faithful at the post. I really respect those people who are dependable. In many ways, tenacious. They're the ones that make the wheels turn in the church and in the kingdom of God. They stay faithful at the post, and for whatever reason they choose not to lose heart or give up. The Apostle Paul was that kind of follower of Jesus Christ. And the thing I want to focus your attention on this morning is some of the things that will give us insights, maybe give us the secret to why Paul never quit and never gave up. Why he never lost hope. The first thing I would say that's important in understanding Paul staying by the stuff is he felt a great responsibility. You see that in verse 1. He said, "We have this ministry." Don't miss those words. He had been given a responsibility. Jesus Christ had called him to be an apostle. He was to minister according to the new covenant. He would have a ministry of preaching salvation by grace. And he had been given this ministry. And he realized that he had a responsibility greater than his personal interest in life. And so he had a duty. Now that's a word people don't like today. It's a word that people frown on today. Some would classify it as a 4-letter dirty word, duty. But I'm here to tell you it's a good word. It's a word we need to recapture in our vocabularies. People say today, I quit going to church because I just didn't want to go out of a sense of duty. I've heard people say, I'm not going to stay in this marriage out of a sense of duty. Others have said, I have quit giving my money to support the work of God because I didn't like giving just because I felt obligated. Now listen to me. One reason there's so much irresponsibility in the church and irresponsibility in our world today is we've convinced ourselves that we shouldn't do something unless it's enjoyable, unless it's fun, unless it makes us feel good. That's not true. Much of life is just fulfilling God-given responsibility. Doing what we should do under God. Showing up on time, whether you feel like it or not. Doing your job rather than doing something else. You'd rather go play and have fun than have to get into this work. Disciplining your children when it would be easy to just overlook their behavior and not get into it. Performing quality work even when you're tired. Life, ladies and gentlemen, was never intended to be all fun and games. Cavett Roberts said, and I quote, character is the ability to stay with a resolution long after the mood in which the resolution was made has left. Can I give you a true sign of maturity in an individual? Maturity is when you can keep going when you've lost joy and enthusiasm regarding a God-given responsibility. A mature person can keep going. I'm going to give you my personal testimony this morning. I'm going to take my halo off. I'm just going to be gut level honest. I've been a minister for over 50 years. I've pastored some incredible churches. I pastored churches where I would show up early in the morning and leave late at night. Had multiple people on staffs to direct, programs to plan, things to do, preaching to prepare for, counseling to do, on and on we could go. And I can honestly tell you that most of my ministry, I showed up at the office early in the morning looking forward to the experience. I loved serving the Lord and God's people. To me, it was the greatest work in the world, still is. But I got to be honest and tell you, sometimes I wasn't all that eager to go into the office. There were some days when I kind of felt down. There was times when I just said I'd rather stay home. But I had been given this ministry, and it was my responsibility. It was my duty. And there were those days, I say before you, that I went and performed my responsibilities out of a sense of duty and responsibility. Now, most of the time, it wasn't that way. There were some Sundays that I came to church, most of the time eager to preach the word. Most of the time looking forward to shaking hands. We're not going to be able to do much of that in the future, I don't think. Shaking hands, smiling at folks, talking to people. enjoying fellowship most Sundays. That was tremendous for me. But there were those times when my alarm clock would go off and I wanted to hit it and call my associate pastor, Eddie D. Hunt, or some other associate, and say, I just not coming in today, you're on. There were those times when I didn't feel like it. I wasn't feeling good. But you know what? I made myself go. And I decided it's best to serve God by faith, not by feelings. And I would show up and discharge my duties, for I had been given this ministry. And it was a responsibility, and it was a duty. And I'll tell you what I learned. Those days when I showed up, I didn't feel like singing, smiling, preaching, talking. I didn't feel like getting up there and looking out over the congregation, see some of those folks saying, "Bless me if you can, Brother Wayne." I didn't feel like looking over that congregation on that Lord's Day to see them kind of implying, "I bet you can't keep me awake today." There's some times I didn't want to go face that kind of stuff. But you see, I showed up out of a sense of duty. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "Fear God and keep His commandments." Don't miss that. For this is what? The whole duty of man. Fear Him, reverence Him, and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of a man. I come to church on the Lord's Day because the Bible commands me, let us not give up meeting together. I come and smile and shake hands and speak to folks because the Bible commands me to be kind one to another. I sing because the Bible commands me to sing the glory of God's name and make His praise glorious, Psalm 66:2. I preach because the Bible commands me, those called to preach the Word, to be instant in season and out of season. When you feel like it and when you don't. When it's a good time, when it's a bad time, still preach the Word. And here's what I've discovered. I discovered when I went and discharged my duties, regardless to my feelings, I went by faith. I discovered that when I do something because I've been given this ministry, it's my responsibility, my spirit begins to pick up after I do it. And I discovered that my enthusiasm returns in the process of just discharging my responsibilities. We need to develop a commitment to keep going regardless of our feelings. Someone rightly said, "I slept and dreamed that life was beauty. I woke and found that life was duty." I think it's probably true that many times Paul didn't feel like doing what he did. But he had been given this ministry. It was his responsibility. He didn't feel like going to prison, I promise you. He didn't feel like being flogged. He didn't feel like being shipwrecked and rejected. But he refused to quit. And he kept going. You know, I got a conviction that when Jesus went to the cross for us, it didn't feel good. But you see, Jesus had been given this ministry of reconciliation. In 1957, Oscar Mills, 27-year-old Indiana State Trooper, Highway Patrolman. He was chasing a speeder and lost control of his car, was seriously injured. His wife and children were called to the hospital. Oscar Mills was unconscious, had gone into a coma. He went into a deep coma. Hours went by, and then days, and then weeks, and then months, and yes, years. And finally, a little over 8 years later, he never regained consciousness. He died. Do you know where his wife was when he died? I'll tell you where she was. She was at the same place she had been nearly every one of those 3,055 days her husband was in a coma. There had been no communication for over 8 years, no affection, no sign of hope for over 8 years. But she stayed at his side out of love and commitment and duty. She said, he loved me and was committed to me and sacrificed so much for me. How could I do any less? And she had that ministry. She married him for better or worse, in sickness and in health. And it's that kind of commitment we need to see in folks. And it's that kind of commitment that keeps us from quitting. Parents, one of the best lessons you can teach your children is a sense of responsibility. Insist that they do their chores even when they're a little tired. Teach them to go to school even if they have a little headache. Make them write thank you notes. Make them do that. Insist they go to church when they don't want to go. Let me tell you something this morning. Hear me, parents. I believe that for every one person who says, I don't go to church today because I was made to go when I was a child, there are 20 people going to church today because they were made to go when they were a child. We need to teach our kids responsibility, that you do something because it's the God-given duty. It's what God expects of us. We have this responsibility, this ministry. And so Paul did not lose heart. He didn't quit because he felt he had a responsibility. He had been given a ministry. And second, he didn't quit because over the years he just developed resiliency. Did you notice verse 8 through 9? Listen to this. I want to read it to you. I'm reading from the New King James Version. We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Something had happened along the way with the great Apostle Paul. He had developed resiliency. He didn't quit when the going got tough. And I've looked at all these words in verses 8 through 9. I've read them in different translations. The NIV said, we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. The King James said, we're troubled on every side, yet not destroyed. The New King James said, but not despairing. See, Paul knew stress, friend. Life wasn't roses. Life wasn't easy. He knew about the tension of travel schedules and traveling, the stress that was there. He knew about personnel problems. He knew about money problems. And yet he said, I was perplexed, but not in despair. The Living Bible paraphrases it, we are perplexed because we don't know why these things happen as they do, but we don't give up and quit. Paul didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what God was up to. He didn't know why God permitted this, but he refused to yield to doubt and despair, and that's what resiliency is. Refusing to yield to doubt, despair, and discouragement. That verse 9 really stands out. Persecuted, but not forsaken. He had been ridiculed, beaten, stoned, imprisoned. But God hadn't abandoned him, and that was sufficient. He said, cast down, destroyed. In Acts 14, there's always been a passage about Paul that intrigued me. In that passage, he is stoned at a place called Lystra. They stoned him for preaching the gospel. They then drug his body outside the city and threw it by the road. And then some disciples came and gathered around him. I think they prayed over him. They gathered around him, and it says that he got up. Now, some Bible scholars say he died there and he was resurrected, and that's the time he went and had visions in the third heaven because he had died. But the Bible is clear that he appeared to have died, is the Greek text. So the Bible doesn't say he died. And yet he got up. Those disciples prayed. He went back in town, and he left the next day with Barnabas, and they went up to Derbe and preached that day. Can you imagine Paul standing there bruised, cut, been beaten? he looked like a mess, stood there and preached, and many people got saved in Derby. And then it happened. They came back to Lystra, and Paul ministered to the saints there and people there. The place where they'd beaten him and left him for dead, he returned a couple of days later and ministered again. He was not a quitter. Now, I'm going to tell you about Wayne Dubose. If they had beaten me up and threw me by the side of the road, I think I'd begin to think to myself, maybe it's time for me to retire. I might have said, there's got to be an easier way to make a living. I'm going to sell insurance, or I can be a sports announcer. I love sports. I can do that. Maybe I started planning another way to make a living. But Paul got up and went back and stayed by the stuff. The Living Bible says we get knocked down, but we get up again and we keep going. That's a resilient spirit. In a Knoxville newspaper several years ago, in an issue of that newspaper, on a particular day, there were two different stories about similar situations. There was a story about a man whose girlfriend jilted him. He wrote a suicide note, and in that suicide note, he said, "She was the love of my life, the only one I'll ever love. She now has found someone else. My life is ruined, and I don't want to go on." And he jumped off the Hensley Bridge in Knoxville, Tennessee. Committed suicide. In that same newspaper that day was another article about a similar situation. A fellow's girl had jilted him. He was an Air Force corporal, the article said, and his girlfriend had jilted him. And you know what he did? He sat down and wrote about how his heart ached. He wrote about his heartache. He decided to put it in a country song. And he did that, and it became a hit song, and he made thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Why did I tell you that story? Simple. When romance fails, don't go jump off a bridge. Write a song about it and get rich. Be sure you got a good title if you're going to make it in country music. Something like Bubba Shot the Jukebox Last Night. Those kind of titles always grab country music fans. But the guy went out and found out disappointment, you can make it pay. You can make it pay. That's the kind of spirit Paul had. He didn't just endure disappointment. He employed disappointment. And he used it to keep going and honor God. He was knocked down often, but never knocked out. Don't quit in the work of God. This is a difficult time we're all going through. Don't lose heart. In 1852, a long time ago, the California vineyard owners were facing bankruptcy, a drought. Their crops were about to come in, a drought hit, and those grapes withered up and dried all through all those vineyards in California. Bankruptcy was facing them. But one of those vineyard owners decided to pick his wrinkled up little old grapes. He decided to pick them and carry them to the market, and he advertised them as Peruvian delicacies. And you and I have been eating raisins ever since. And this is an example of a guy who made something good out of a bad situation. Edison invented the telegraph, scientific mind, many inventions. Wanting to work for the railroad, spilt some acid on a train and got intrigued about scientific research. What made that cause a fire and so forth. Got his mind going. And something bad got him going. He became the great inventor. John Wesley was a missionary who failed miserably. He came to Georgia to try to convert the Indians in Georgia. He flopped. He went back to England, broken-hearted, ready to quit the ministry. And then something happened. He really got saved. He gave his heart to the Lord, got close to the Lord, helped start a revival in England. And as a result of his ministry, the Methodist Church grew. Here was a guy who failed, but he found success. We could go on and on talking about that. I lived in the neighborhood where Michael Jordan lived in Hoover, Alabama, while he was trying to play baseball, the Birmingham Barons. He was in my neighborhood. He was one of the leading scorers in the NBA. He was most valuable player more than once. Great basketball player. Some say the greatest. Are you aware that they cut him from his 10th grade high school basketball team? But he didn't give up. He had a resilience. He kept playing, and look what happened. Paul had this resilience. He said in verse 15 what was behind driving him to do this. He said, I'm doing all these things no matter, because all this bad's happening. I'm doing all these things for your sake. Verse 15 of 2 Corinthians 4. He endured hardship for the benefit of others. Been a many a wife who was married to a sorry, cantankerous man. Made her life miserable, and she'd even think about, I will leave this turkey. And then she'd think she had 3 or 4 kids, and they don't need to grow up away from their daddy, and because of others, her children, she made the choice to stay. I'm not talking about staying when there's brutality and cruel treatment. But she made the choice to stay in not a good situation for the children's sake, for others. The nurses, we're celebrating them, and medical personnel these days. Through the years, I've thought about that profession. It has been, in the past, low pay on the scale of pay. You have to put up with demanding patients, bad hours and shifts sometimes. And there's always exposure to dangerous disease, as we are aware of today. Why do they keep doing it? Because most of those nurses took a vow to serve the medical needs of others. The policemen are the same way. Many of them are spit upon and abused, and they'll stay in there because they know we need law and order. It's the good for society that they do their jobs for others. I remember in my 7th year at Summer Grove in 1987, little Jessica McClure, an 18-year-old girl, fell in a well in Midland, Texas. The nation was captivated. How were they going to get this little girl out of this well? She was in that well for 58 hours. She had fallen way down this hole in a very small pipe. They could tell she was still alive to begin with. They could hear her crying. And they began to bring the greatest minds from around the world flew in. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars developing a strategy of how they would bore a shaft a certain distance from that well, and then they'd have to come across, and they had to hit at the precise place where that baby was. It was dangerous because it could make that thing cave in on her or cave in on these guys that were digging and going. It was dangerous, and it's amazing how much money was spent. People were very involved in that, and people risked their lives to save that child. People will do incredible things for others. And that's why in the ministry we keep going. Paul did not lose heart. He had been given this duty, this responsibility, this ministry. Life wasn't about his personal joy and happiness, fun and games. It was about fulfilling God's purposes for him. And he developed this resiliency because he was committed to not quitting. That's the heart of resiliency. You make up your mind, you don't quit. My daddy taught me growing up, Wayne, when it's too tough for most folks, it's just right for us Duboses. I wanted to quit a job selling Bibles out west. Hot summer one time, dogs would bite me and chase me, and people slammed doors in my face. My daddy said, son, I didn't raise a quitter. You're not going to quit. My daddy taught me to be committed to staying with anything. And that is important. Resilient people are committed to never quitting. And the third thing here, Paul never lost heart because he had this great responsibility. He developed resiliency, and he focused on eternity. Did you notice what the scripture says in verse 18? So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Paul lived his life focusing his attention not on the physical world and the physical, but on the spiritual. things unseen like God. I think he focused on eternity. He focused on heaven. Listen to me, folks. You know what the real world is? It's the spiritual world. The physical world's passing away. The Washington Monument will one day be gone. Jerry's house over in Dallas, where the Cowboys play, will one day be gone. The Superdome will one day be gone. These are temporal things. The physical world is passing. It's the spiritual world that's permanent and eternal and real. And Paul kept focusing on eternity. And that can help you keep going when you know the best is yet to come. It was a foggy day, July the 4th, 1952, when Florence Chadwick, a swimmer, decided to swim from California across to the Catalina Island, a distance of about 26 miles from where she would start. She became a world-famous distance swimmer. She swam the English Channel, both sides. Started one side, went over here. That side went back here. Incredible swimmer. Did it in record times. First woman to swim to Catalina Island. She tried that day, but she failed the first time she tried. Her mother was in a boat and her trainer going alongside her as she was swimming. Another boat was there with men with guns to shoot sharks if they came around. She swam and she swam for 15 hours, 55 minutes, and she waved her hands enough. She quit, and they helped her get in the boat. She was interviewed. She said, "I didn't quit because it was cold. I didn't quit because I was tired. She said, I quit because I couldn't see the shore. It was a cloudy, foggy day." Did you get that? I couldn't see the shore. And they couldn't tell her where she was. And the truth was, she was about a mile from the shore. She just couldn't see it. Some of you listening to me today, you're pretty close to the shore. I'm getting pretty close to the shore. And we need to focus our attention on things we can't see. The best is yet to come. We've got a lot to live for. Build God's kingdom. Heaven's going to be wonderful. We're going to see Him one day. We want to hear Him say, "Well done." We're going to focus on the future and what's ahead. Now, I'm 73. And Paul said in this passage I read, he talked about the body. He said in verse 16, it's wasting away. I can testify to that. My body's in decline. When I was 46 years of age, I made a decision not to play on a three-man's basketball league anymore. I loved basketball. But I found out I couldn't jump quite like I used to. My reflexes were slower. My eyes were getting bad. And I just wasn't as good as I used to be. And I hung it up at 46 because the body's starting to decline. You may be in perfect health today. Wonderful. Do all you can to stay healthy. But I promise you, great health is not a permanent thing. If you live long enough, you will experience some decline. And in that times when you realize, hey, this old body's kind of wearing down on me, if you can keep your eyes on the shore that's out there somewhere you can't see, you won't grow discouraged. The best is still yet to come. I talked to a referee in my church one day, an official. He refereed basketball games for years. He said he hated to referee a game where guys were playing over 36 years of age. Said they were hard to deal with. He said they can't run like they used to, but they think they can. They can't jump like they used to, but they think they can. They think they can play like they could when they were teenagers and in their 20s, but they can't. And they don't want to accept that, so they blame the referees and fuss at us about everything they can't do. Yeah, it's wearing out. But let's focus on things not seen. The shore is just out there somewhere. Don't give up. The best is yet to come. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie. Through the years, I've tried to encourage my worship leaders. We try a lot of different music, and we do a lot of different things, and we're not stuck in the mud of the past. But I tell them we must not stop singing about heaven. We got to, along the way, keep that before our people. And so we sing, when the roll's called up yonder, I'll be there. We sing, some glad morning I'll fly away. We sing, this world is not my home. We sing in the sweet by and by. Because you see, that's the goal, getting home to be with Jesus throughout all eternity. This world's passing. There's an eternal world coming, and it's the most real world out there. Folks, don't give up. We've been given this ministry. We've got some responsibility, God-given responsibility. And let's stay resilient, committed to not quitting. That's what resiliency is. And let's keep focusing on the future. Things we can't even see. God, heaven, so forth. There's so much that awaits us. Let's stay by the stuff. Let's press on. Don't lose heart. Great days are ahead. Heavenly Father, we pray that you use this message to encourage brothers and sisters in the Lord as we've been going through some of the most difficult days of our lives. Some in our community have died because of COVID-19. Our hearts have been wrenched. Some are right now battling for their lives. Some have been healed, snatched from the jaws of death, and we praise your name for it. And we've all lived with extra stress. Our world's been turned upside down. We're not sure exactly how all this is going to flesh out in the future. We're waiting to hear what we can do next, when we can do it, when it's safe. So many questions unanswered in our minds. But in the midst of all this, help us to not lose heart. You've given us this ministry. You've given us task. Help us stay by the stuff, stay committed to not quitting, and keep focusing on things unseen, and that can carry us on. In Jesus' name we pray.